All of us over the age of 40 are losing muscle every day unless we do something about it. And we know that muscle is made of protein. So it's intuitive, it's natural to think that if you want to build extra muscle, you should eat extra protein. But is that true? That's what my narrative review is about, answering that question. Has the USDA underestimated optimal protein intake requirements for healthy older adults? To answer that question, I did a review of the literature and found 15 clinical trials, investigations, that looked at exactly that question. Are older adults getting enough protein compared to what the USDA advises? And of those 15 studies, 8 of them said, no, we are not getting enough protein. We need more than the USDA advises. And 7 said, we're good. The USDA is correct. So it sounds like a toss-up, but it's really not. The best way to measure whether you're getting enough protein to build muscle is to measure change in muscle. Are you getting stronger? Do you have more muscle mass? To use that as your primary outcome, a change in muscle strength or growth. And of the 15 studies I looked at, 6 of them used that as their primary endpoint, a change in muscle strength or growth. And of those 6 studies, 4 of them showed we are getting enough protein if we follow USDA advice. 2 of them said we're not. There are some weaknesses with those studies that I talk about in my paper. The next most common method used in these 15 studies to decide whether we're getting enough protein is with something called the nitrogen balance method. That's considered the gold standard for deciding, compared to how much protein we're taking in and excreting, whether we're getting enough. And using this nitrogen balance method, 4 of the 4 studies using that method, 3 of them said we are getting enough. The USDA is correct. 1 of them said we are not. Now that left 5 studies of these 15 that used what are called intermediate endpoints for deciding whether we're getting enough protein and inferring from those endpoints whether muscle mass can be expected to increase or decrease or whatever. The methods used for these 5 studies included muscle protein synthesis and something called indicator amino acid oxidation. Both of these methods can be used in a really short time period, days or a couple of weeks, to get their findings, and they did. And as I said, those 5 studies said we need more protein than the USDA advises. But it's worth noting that none of those 5 studies included an analysis of muscle growth at the end of those studies. And they didn't do it not because they were negligent, but because they didn't have time. As you know, to measure a change in muscle strength or growth, you've really got to give it several weeks, really ideally several months, because it's a slow process. And all this begs the question, why didn't all 15 of these studies use muscle growth as their primary endpoint? And the answer is, it's expensive and time-consuming to do that. Let's say it would take 3 months to get an accurate measure of change in muscle strength or growth. For all of those 3 months, for the participants in your study, you'd have to follow as well as a change in muscle strength or growth from the beginning to the end, and as well as protein intake from the beginning to the end in a control group and in an intervention group. You'd also need to know what are all the participants doing for the whole duration of the study with respect to exercise, and what are they doing with respect to other caloric intake, and what's going on with those participants for the whole duration of the study with respect to acute or chronic illness that could make a difference in how much muscle they're able to build. Confounding factors, as they're called. That's really hard to do. And one of the things I learned in doing this narrative review is Nutrition studies are limited by what they can usefully do, in part because of the expense and the difficulty of controlling for those confounding factors. And so researchers are naturally drawn to shorter outcome studies where they can use these intermediate endpoints that I mentioned and to draw conclusions from them. But that can be a dangerous thing to do, because using these intermediate endpoints is not the same as finding the true endpoint you're looking for, in this case, a change in muscle growth or strength. They may not be the same thing. So given that ambiguity, that uncertainty, and the wide variety of findings that I just described for you, I looked as well at other ways of assessing the problem, epidemiologic views, observational trials, they're called, looking at big populations to see what are they doing and is it working for them. And one of the three groups I looked at was babies. I'm interested in that because babies are the one group of people for whom we know exactly how much protein they need, because it's in breast milk, so we don't have to guess. And the short story is they need just over twice what the USDA advises for us older adults, or adults of any age for that matter, 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. Babies take about 1.64 grams per kilogram per day over the first year, higher in the first quarter, lesser at the end of the first year. Now that's about twice what the USDA advises for us, and that sounds like a lot, and it is. But keep in mind, babies do something we never do again, not as children, not as adults. They triple in size in that first year, and they grow 10 inches taller. Now, some of the studies that I described in my report advise we take up to twice what the USDA advises, just what babies take. And that really would be remarkable if it were true, because we adults don't do anything like what they do in that first year of life. The second epidemiologic view I took to examine this problem involved sarcopenia, looking at the prevalence of the loss of muscle mass that occurs with age. That's what sarcopenia is. And I compared the prevalence of sarcopenia in a country with just about the highest protein intake, that's us, the United States, 90 to 100 grams per day, with the country with the lowest annual protein intake, that would be India, at about just over half what we take, 55 grams a day. And I would think that if our protein intake is inadequate, we would expect the prevalence of sarcopenia to be much higher in India, where they're taking just about half our protein intake compared to ours. But it's not, it's the same, it's 17%. In fact, in rural India, it's less than that, it's 14.1%. And I think that fact that their prevalence of sarcopenia in rural India is even less than ours, despite taking just about half our daily protein intake, has to do with what's likely a very big difference in the level of exercise that rural Indians compared to Americans are including in their daily life. They're probably much more active than we are. And it's probably true that exercise, not additional protein, is what's needed to build muscle mass. The third epidemiologic area that I looked at to examine this problem involved hunter-gatherers. Now, we're living at a unique time in our history. We have grocery stores everywhere and processed foods readily available. We have no shortage of calories, no shortage of protein. And that, of course, has not always been true. For most of our 300,000-year hominid history, humans have not had regular access to calories, let alone to protein. We left Africa about 70,000 years ago and made it to every continent except Antarctica, and thrived all over the world with widely varying diets available, widely varying sources of protein and amounts of protein available, and thrived in all those environments. And one of the studies I reference in my paper describes how there's a really wide range of protein intake among hunter-gatherers today and very likely in the past. And that makes sense. It would have to be true, given where we came from and how we lived for the vast majority of our history, that we're good at conserving protein. Humans can't store extra protein, but we can conserve it extraordinarily well. We did, and we do. So if you look at the problem from an epidemiologic view, looking at babies, looking at hunter-gatherers, looking at the prevalence of sarcopenia, and if you look at the clinical trials using muscle mass as their primary endpoint, the evidence points to the USDA being correct, that we need about 0.8 grams per kilogram per day of protein. That's about 70 grams for a 150-pound person. That's 1.5 eggs, a couple of slices of bread, a cup of yogurt, a small piece of chicken, and a small handful of nuts or seeds. That's 70 grams. I think that further studies would be useful because there's been controversy about this for over a century. And studies using those intermediate endpoints that I mentioned, muscle protein synthesis and the indicator amino acid oxidation method, those are useful as well if they're used in tandem with measuring muscle strength or mass at the end of those studies, because that is the important endpoint. And if those authors using those intermediate endpoints find we do need more protein than the USDA advises, I think they have an obligation to reconcile their findings with the epidemiologic evidence to the contrary. So that's what my study concludes. We're probably getting enough protein by following USDA advice. Hope that's helpful. You can find on my last slide a QR code, and if you photograph that, it'll take you to a copy of my paper, which includes references. Thank you so much for watching.